forged knife better than a stock removal knife? Let's talk about it. Right out of the gate, I'm going to tell you which of these techniques, forging or stock removal, offers the best performance blade. All things being equal, the forged blade is inferior to a stock removal blade. And what do I mean by all things being equal? I mean for any given task, comparing the best suited unforgeable engineered steel to the best suited forging steel with the same hardness, same geometry, will always result in the engineered super steel outperforming the forging steel. Now we have to hand it to stock removal here in one aspect. It's sort of an unfair advantage, but they have a much wider selection of steels to choose from. You can't forge every steel. It's just not practical. Now there's some crossover, mind you. You can forge A2, D2, 154CM, M2. There's some stainless steels you can forge, like some of the 400 series. They make Sanmai with 420, for example. 440C can be forged. They're just very difficult to forge in this case. They forge much slower. You have to use lighter blows. You have to pay much closer attention to temperatures, and then you have to heat treat them in a heat treat oven where you ramp up, soak at one temperature, ramp to another. Fairly easy to quench, usually in air or aluminum plates or something not too heady. But people don't forge those steels because this is the crux of the argument. If there's an advantage to forging over stock removal, you would see people forging A2, D2, 154CM, and M2, all these other steels that are difficult to forge. They would be doing that, but guess what? They're not, because there's probably no real advantage, okay? So stock removal has a giant leg up on forgers in that they have an almost infinite selection of steels to work from, where forgers are confined to sort of these legacy type steels. Once every 10 years, someone makes a new steel to forge with. CrewForge 5 or ADCRV2 might be some of the newer additions. I don't know. So we'll just say that there is an unfair advantage, at least in some respects, to stock removers. But that's part of the debate. And this thing was hotly debated several decades ago, right? Probably for 20 or 30 years, people were spreading sort of this mythology around the forged blade. And I suspect ultimately many who came down on the side of the forged blades had to concede defeat. And there's still some stragglers to that, though, like Ed Fowler, Ed Caffrey, whom I respect. Their legacies in the knife-making world will be indisputable. But they still have these disciples who cling to some of this sort of ancient supernatural art form mysticism of knife making. They claim to have secret processes and secret knowledge, and they, with years of dedicated work, have figured out how to coax this extra performance out of these forged blades that can't be had with stock removal. And I don't know. I think to a large degree, you might argue that they sort of extended the debate between forged blades and stock removal blades by a decade or so, with them carrying on about it. But clearly at this point, the argument is over. Probably ended, again, probably 7 to 10 years ago. Defeat was conceded. So let's talk about some of the typical arguments people have for forged blades outperforming stock removal blades and being that much more valuable. I think number one is, again, sort of this highly repetitive, sort of time-sensitive secret regimen of heat treatments that a custom maker could just use to get that extra bit of performance out of a knife. And that is well divorced from recognized science. I think there's some calling forth of the sort of, again, mysticism heralded by the Japanese tradition in some cases, and folding and hammering, impurities and packing the edge, and special heat treatment. At any rate, I think that's one reason, one of the arguments that was made, and in some respects continues to be made by a few people today. I think one of the other things that people argue in favor of for the forged blade is a couple of processes. One is os forging, which is touted actually in Jim Hersulis's book, The Complete Bladesmith. And in that, Jim states that he was taught a technique by a 50-year-old cutler for the German army who himself had learned forging at the old Solingen factories in Germany, and that's quite a pedigree. Jim describes it as forging steel at or under critical temperature, but before the steel drops out of the cherry red color. The theory being that austenite is being broken down and refined into finer and finer crystals as it transforms back into pearlite, and that it resets sort of grain boundaries and such. And he claims the process works especially well in D2. I mean, does it? It sounds like complete horse hockey to me. Packing the edge is another term you might hear. As I understand it, this is actually true sort of cold forging on gray steel. Sort of the same process, working a small area along the edge of the knife. And the claim here seems to be very similar to those for os forging. Cracked, reset grain boundaries, finer grain, etc. Almost it's like you're sort of work hardening bronze. It's calling on that sort of imagery, work hardening bronze and non-ferric metal or copper or whatever. There's a good forum post by Stacy E. Apelt on packing and os forging. He basically explains that any hammering of austenite will essentially just create voids. It doesn't pack stuff together. It takes those sort of maximally compacted molecules, and shifts them away from each other and unpacks them and creates voids. And if it's carried on to high a degree, you actually start making cracks. And the cracks will weaken the steel. So you're actually making things less dense rather than more dense, which is sort of the opposite as you would expect, I think. But Kevin Cashin has also destroyed the mythology around hammers creating better blades than grinders in the era of modern steel in multiple posts. And I'll quote one of them here because I really like it. It's sort of the idea that I sort of cling to when I think about this. He says, quote, "Where does the idea of creating a superior blade by forging or making a better metal by hammering originate? It's a very old concept left over from the days when it was a fact, before the Industrial Revolution gave us methods to mass produce molten steel at our bidding. There was the age-old process of bloomery steel." He goes on to talk about the bloom requiring, chemical reduction. It's never fully liquefied. There's contaminants in there that has to be forged out and hammered out and things like that. So for centuries, forging wasn't just a way to make better steel. It was the only way to make steel at all. Yeah, so back in the day, you had to hammer out impurities and homogenize different pieces of bloomery steel together with piling and faggoting and folding and hammering. And unless you were in an area of the world that enjoyed crucible steel, but that brought its own challenges. Contamination with phosphorus and sulfur, still very difficult to forge in some cases, a lot of cases. A lot of these ideas like os forging and packing the edge are just sort of calling forth on that history and bringing that into the era of modern steel, where it has no purpose. It doesn't serve a purpose in the modern steel industry. This steel went under a 20-ton press before it came to you, right? It's already been packed. I've seen a few posts with references to industrial processes that use os forging, or as it's called in the industry, os forming. And I don't know really much about them. I did see a Kevin Cashin post where he references a book called The Principles of Heat Treatment by a guy named Krauss. He describes os forming in large industrial applications that don't apply to knife making, using steels that aren't used in knife making. And so it's not something that you reproduce on your hammer and anvil with any purpose whatsoever. But os forming does exist, and it does lend certain properties to steel under certain conditions, none of which we see in knife making. Top tier steels, for both methods, again, good heat treat, identical blade geometry, the plethora of purpose-driven steels and high wear-resistant modern engineer powdered steels will beat forging steels almost every time in performance. But what about cost? These steels are pricey. A bar of K390 steel large enough to make a single fixed blade costs 4 or 5 times more than the same bar of 1084. More grit, more time is necessary to shape the knife and then sharpen it later, right? How much edge retention is too much edge retention? No one ever talks about that. Everyone just wants to push that boundary further and further. How much toughness is really needed in a knife before its form fails for the task that requires that amount of toughness? A knife is not a pry bar, but let's take that as an example. Let's just make a knife out of pry bar steel and use it like a pry bar. A knife is still not a pry bar. It's not shaped like a pry bar. So there comes a point where toughness gets a little bit useless. It's not, the form of the knife doesn't serve the purpose for the toughness of the steel. And so, I don't know. There is a line to cross, and I think in some cases you would argue that some steels tend to cross that line. I mean, the irony is, you want a high edge retention because you don't want to sharpen your knife. You don't like sharpening knives. But then when you go to sharpen one of these super steel knives, it's not like it's easy to sharpen. They're highly abrasion resistant. It takes time. And some of the techniques and stones you use, like a diamond stone, some of the diamond stones, it's suggested don't provide as much edge retention as other methods of sharpening. And so at some point, the snake just starts eating its tail a little bit. And I've made that argument before. I guess we shouldn't really go too far into that. But at any rate, we've talked about performance, and I conceded defeat for the forged blade on performance. But that is not the question in front of us today. The question is, which one is better? And here's the biggest issue of all. And here I hearken to the image of Hapu Nahasasimapetalon from The Simpsons, who says, quote, "Who needs the infinite compassion of Ganesha when I've got Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman staring at me from Entertainment Weekly with their dead eyes?" Sometimes I feel that way when I look at stock removal fixed blade knives. It's harder to appreciate their heart and soul, and there's certainly less opportunity for artistic expression. No forge welding, no Damascus, no forge finish, no hammering to shape. Not as much blood, sweat, and tears, and there's an extra level of craftsmanship, an extra skill set in that forging that's not there in stock removal. It has to be appreciated. This is a valid argument in my eyes, and the main attraction for the forged blade in my eyes. It's worth the degradation in performance from the top tier super steels, I think, because a well heat treated and designed forged blade still outperforms most users. And if you don't like sharpening knives, wait until you have to put an edge back on M4. All right, guys, that's it. Have a good one. I'll see you next time.